postmodern thinking. And apparently that is what largely drives a lot of people's thinking who went through social sciences and other, areas like sociology. And many of those people are actually in the environmental movement. Mm-hmm. And if you actually look at postmodern thinking, which leads to critical theory and a lot of these things, postmodern thinking is very odd. It rejects classical liberal ideas of evidence-based decision-making, rational, open debates between people, respect of alternative points of view. They base their ideas and the way they want to run the world, including the environment, they want to base it on storytelling and feelings. I don't know. When it's minus 30 and I'm stuck way out in the snowbank somewhere in the boondocks, I don't know if my feelings are going to be very positive about EVs.
No, you really just need a car that works to get you out of there safely. It doesn't matter whether it looks environmentally friendly or not. What matters is if it actually does its job.
Yeah. Well, I was watching a debate between Heartland's president, James Taylor, who you've met actually because you went to one of the conferences with me.
Yes.
And in Chicago. It was really great, by the way. People can check out these conferences. Just look at heartland.org and click on the conferences link. And it was interesting because he was debating some environmentalists, and he explained how the statistics and the data and the science and the evidence didn't actually match what they were saying when it came to wind and solar power. It didn't matter. They just went off on a tangent anyways, giving all this emotion and excitement about their point of view and telling stories about how we had to save the children. Mm. I mean, we're going to have a show about this in the future because the whole idea of rejecting classical liberalism that led to our society, that led to science, and science, of course, is a major ingredient behind a lot of our society, this is really quite dangerous, and it's really quite stupid, actually. Imagine designing a rocket ship based on postmodern thinking. Oh, well, I don't feel that a vacuum is actually dangerous to me, so I don't need a life support system. Okay, good luck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly wouldn't work.
Now, let's try and answer the question about the main selling points of electric vehicles, and that is the whole idea that they're somehow reducing emissions. Remember, they call them zero-emission vehicles. Mm-hmm. Once again, we should go to Bob Lyman, the ICSC Canada Economics and Policy Advisor, and cite a few of his things. What does Bob actually say? Can you tell us what he says in his report about this idea that we're reducing CO2 emissions? They're zero-emission vehicles, we're told.
Yeah, so Bob says, to begin with, about half the lifetime carbon dioxide emissions from an electric car comes from the energy used to produce the car, especially in the mining and processing of the raw materials needed for the battery. This compares unfavorably with the manufacture of a gasoline-powered car, which accounts for 17% of the car's lifetime carbon dioxide emissions.
Huh.
When a new electric vehicle appears in the showroom, it has already been responsible for 30,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions. This equivalent amounts to manufacturing a conventional car, 14,000 pounds. Once on the road, the carbon dioxide emissions of electric vehicles depend on the power generation fuel used to recharge the battery.
Now, let me see if I got that right. By the time an electric car gets to the showroom, it's already responsible for double the emissions of producing a conventional car and getting it to the showroom. Did I understand that right?
Yes, it produces huge amounts of emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, just to get it from production to the showroom.
Right.
Not that carbon dioxide emissions are a problem. However, if that's what they're looking at to compare, then it certainly doesn't compare with a regular car.
Yeah, I'm really glad you pointed it out because we would say, hooray, they're producing more CO2. But of course, these people, if they think, it's funny how the postmodern thinking is not even logically consistent within itself. Oh, we got a climate catastrophe. We have to reduce CO2 emissions. So they're pushing things that in many cases actually increase it. You have to drive an electric vehicle for a long time, apparently, before you actually save on CO2 emissions. And think of all that terrible pollution being produced during the actual production of the components.
Yes, that's the kind of pollution that really matters, not the CO2 pollution.
Yeah, well
not
put.
Pollution.
Yeah, and I should direct listeners to a show. It's Michael Moore's movie, Planet of the Humans. Now, that's an amazing film because Michael Moore, of course, is a very strong left-winger, but he's showing how the left have had the wool pulled over their eyes, that in fact wind and solar power, I can't remember if he addresses EV batteries, he probably does, they're incredibly environmentally destructive. But, the left are telling us that we can power our EV battery construction. We can power the actual batteries when we're charging them. We can power it with wind and solar power. Now, you and I were driving with our daughter, Carolyn, my daughter, Carolyn, your sister, and our mom, your mom. We were driving in upstate New York, and you saw a wind turbine farm on the horizon. And you folks said, oh, we're going to run to the base of the wind turbine. Well, what actually happened?
Well, it actually is a lot larger than we thought it was. So we actually never made it there.
Yeah, you ran for a quarter of a mile or so. And
they're actually extremely, extremely tall.
Yeah, 60 stories typically. Yeah, that's incredible. Now, all of this said, it's interesting to quote the Trudeau government's, they call it a plan. It's a plan. It's a healthy environment and a healthy economy, which really actually sounds like an unhealthy environment and an unhealthy economy. But anyway, here's what they say that they've done so far with regards to boosting, quote, zero emission vehicles, which of course is like right out of 1984. That's newspeak. Of course, they're highly emitting vehicles. It says, this is what they say in their plan, that this is what they've done so far. Set zero emission vehicle sales targets for new passenger vehicles, 10% by 2025, 30 by 2030. And they want to have 100% of our vehicles, for new ones anyways, by 2040, electric vehicles. They've invested already $300 million in these sorts of programs to make zero-emission vehicles supposedly more affordable. Well, if you gave me one for free, I think I'd still use my gasoline-powered car because I actually want to get to where I'm going. The other thing they've done, they've invested over $300 million to support the establishment of coast-to-coast network of fast chargers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, man. All this money. Jeez.
Yeah, as if the COVID-19 lockdowns weren't bad enough for our economy. And looks like my generation, generations after mine, are going to be paying for this for many decades. And we're not really going to see any benefits from it either. Yeah.
And the government promises even more in their December plan. Here's what else they're going to do. Okay, remember, and this is with environmentally destructive, really unusable electric vehicles, if you actually think about it, because, you know, they're not actually environmentally friendly. They don't necessarily reduce CO2 at all. Here's what they're planning to do. They want to invest, and I'm quoting directly from their December plan, which, as I say, ironically, is called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. We should put out a counter report called An Unhealthy Environment and an Unhealthy Economy by following their plan. Anyway, invest an additional, this is what they're going to do, invest an additional $287 million over 2 years. That's over $250 million, starting actually now, to continue the, quote, incentives for zero-emission vehicles program until March 2022. Okay? They want to invest an additional $150 million over 3 years in charging and refueling stations across Canada. The goal is to ensure that every Canadian, urban and rural, can easily charge their, quote, zero-emission vehicles. These are sort of magical thinking, I guess. This must be postmodern thinking. It's not based on actual data or observation. This is magical thinking. Anyway, they're going to allow us now to recharge our magical zero-emission vehicles all the way across Canada, okay? And they say to date, they've already installed 4,300 charging stations. Thank you. For what, eh?
And it looks like there's many more to come. And we can really ask for what? To charge batteries for cars that don't really work well in our climate and that cost a fortune and that use slave and child labor and aren't even good for the environment.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to think of an acronym other than zero-emission vehicles. Like maybe, what would we call it? We'd call our coal car with high emissions, environmentally destructive, child labor cars.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be a good selling point? Do you think very many people would buy it if they said what was really the case instead of some kind of fictitious magical thinking that there's zero emission, beneficial, etc.?
Yeah, we really need a new name for it, and something that reflects the fact that it's not environmentally friendly, not going to be good for our economy either.
Yeah. So yeah, I encourage listeners, do write in this comment section under our podcast. Give us your suggestions. What should EV vehicles really be called? Because zero emission vehicles doesn't really sum it up. It strikes me that if consumers actually move to EV vehicles, what they're going to do is they're going to increasingly find themselves freezing in the dark on some remote highway in the middle of the winter. And what are they waiting for? What do you think they'd be waiting for?
Well, for another electric vehicle to hopefully be able to reach them.
Yeah. Or a tow truck. Truck fueled by what?
Fueled by oil, regular gas. So they're not going to be able to get out of these situations by themselves.
Yeah. Now,
you need to have conventional cars, conventional trucks to save them.
To rescue the people with the EVs.
Yes.
Well, let's hope the government doesn't succeed. They certainly are succeeding in spending incredible volumes of our money, which again comes back to your generation. I mean, what do you see when you look to the future? Are we going to be increasingly unable to pay for things like healthcare and schooling and roads? And because we're throwing all this money into nonsense magical ideas.
Yeah, well, it certainly looks like that. Hopefully people wake up to the realities of this, though, before then, so that all the money isn't wasted and taken away from things that are actually important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Now, one thing that is interesting, when I was growing up, we loved to question authority. That was the sort of brand, I guess, of the hippie generation. We questioned everything. Do you find that young people today are digging into the politically correct narratives, the woke ideas, zero emission vehicles, save the planet? Are young people digging into it as much as us hippies used to?
Definitely not. I mean, I don't know what it was like before then, but certainly people my age and younger and slightly older are overall, not everyone, of course, very accepting of the politically correct view, and they don't even want to hear about the other side of the story. If you bring up other points, even pretty hard facts and evidence, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to even consider that it could be correct if it doesn't go ahead with their political views. And everything, of course, can be tied back to people's political views, which can be problematic, especially when you're dealing with science, because it shouldn't be political. But it has been. In
your training, like you were at the Perimeter Institute, you were part of the scholarship. What was the program called?
Perimeter Scholars International. So it's a master's program.
Now, were they based, would they have their science based on postmodern thinking, or was it real science based on classical liberalism approach, evidence-based?
Yeah. So when you go actually, to study physics or other sciences like that, you really just study science. And that's what people should be using for making policies, just basing it off of actual science and evidence. Of course, I was doing theoretical physics, so we weren't doing many experiments, but we were working with people who did experiments. And those will actually help determine what the theories are. So
what would have happened if you, as a theoretician, told the experimenters, well, your data must just be wrong, because my theory says that the mu meson should have a totally different spin or charge or particle, and so your experiments must be wrong? What would you say? Well, the experimentalists wouldn't buy that. They would say, well, change your theory or modify something. Of course, the experiments can be misleading at sometimes. So, check their experiments and see if there's any way they can prove them. But really, it comes back to the theoretician to make a new theory and try to explain the experiment in the end. So people that are concerned about environmental protection, saving species at risk, and that was something we didn't even get into. If you're generating the power with wind and solar power, this is terrible for species at risk. In the case of the solar panels that are being installed near Las Vegas right now, the Genesis power station, they have to pull the desert tortoises out of their burrows and keep them for a full year at a remote location. And the forecast is that half of them will all die. Yeah, that's terrible. Yeah. And also birds with wind turbines. So many birds are killed every year by wind turbines. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And bats, actually, there's twice as many bats killed as birds. The reason being that a bat doesn't have to actually be hit by a wind turbine blade. If they simply fly in the low pressure zone behind the blade, their lungs burst. And so some species of bats, in fact, we talked about with Jarl, who was actually on our show about a year ago, I guess. He's a bat and raptors type expert. And he said that some of these bat species are being driven to extinction because of these silly wind turbines. And that's what they want to power our whole electric vehicles with, is wind and solar. So the EV vehicles are terrible for the environment because of their batteries and the processing required to make them. They cost a fortune. They don't work very well. And even once you're on the road with them, you're still not away from destroying the environment, because they want to use wind and solar power, which are probably the most environmentally unfriendly sources of power on the planet. So, wow, it's just really nuts. So yeah, we got to get this information out